The motorcade arrived at the porte cochere at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning under a sky the color of wet slate. 3 black Cadillac Escalades pulled in line along the curve of the driveway, and the doorman, a man named Henry, who had worked the Morning Post at the Ashford Royale for 19 years, stepped back from the entrance the way staff are trained to step back when they understand without being told that the next person through the door does not want to be welcomed by a stranger. Marcus Hale stepped out of the lead vehicle before the engine had stopped running. He was a heavy man without being a soft one, somewhere in the latter half of his 40s, with cropped iron hair and the kind of shoulders that came from a career of standing in doorways. He had served 12 years in the United States Secret Service before retiring into the private market, and the habits had not retired with him. He scanned the porte cochere across 2 sweeps. He read the roof lines of the buildings across the street. He read the windows of the second floor of the hotel itself. He read the faces of the 3 valets who were watching him from a respectful distance. Only after the entire arc of the entrance had been logged in his memory did he turn back to the second Escalade and open the rear door on the curbside. Vivian Ashcroft stepped out without taking the hand that was offered. She was 36 years old, and she dressed in the way women in her tax bracket dressed when they intended to be photographed, without appearing to have planned for it. Her hair was dark brown, cut blunt at the jawline, and held its shape without seeming to have been attended to that morning. Her suit was charcoal wool, single button, tailored close enough to her frame that the seams disappeared. She wore no rings, no necklace, and no earrings. The only piece of jewelry on her body was a thin men's Patek Philippe on her left wrist, a watch that had belonged to her father and that ran 2 minutes fast because she had never bothered to have it corrected. She did not speak to Marcus as they crossed the lobby. She did not need to. He moved a half step in front of her along the diagonal that took them to the elevators, and the hotel staff who had been gathered near the front desk to receive her parted without being asked. The event taking shape on the second floor was, in the language of the contracts, Vivian's office had circulated 3 weeks earlier, a dual-purpose occasion. The first half of the evening would consummate the merger between Ashcroft Biomedical Group and Crestview Medical Solutions, an arrangement $400 million in scope that had taken her team 11 months to structure. The second half would rebrand the same gathering as a benefit gala for the Ashcroft Children's Medical Center, and $250,000 would be raised from a room that had already been paid for. 250 invitations had gone out. 1 United States Senator had accepted. 2 state senators had accepted. 7 institutional investors managing portfolios in the high billions had accepted. 3 medical reporters from outlets that did not cover anything below national significance had accepted. Vivian entered the ballroom for the first time at 9:31. She walked the perimeter once without speaking. Then she walked the central axis from the stage to the rear doors and back again. Halfway through the second pass, she stopped and informed Sandra, her logistics coordinator, that the VIP tables had been positioned incorrectly. The angle from the senator's seat to the podium did not match the intended sight line. Sandra made a note. 4 minutes later, Vivian stopped again and instructed that the same tables be shifted 6 inches further out, because the second arrangement had created a visual gap that the photographers would notice. Daniel was at the far western corner of the room, balanced on the second rung of a folding aluminum stepladder, working a Phillips head screwdriver against a brass sconce whose mounting plate had loosened sometime during the previous evening's reception. He logged the arrival of Vivian's group the way a man, in his former line of work, logged the arrival of any group entering a space he was responsible for, which was completely and without raising his head. He noted the count. He noted the configuration. He noted the man at point and identified the carriage of a federal protective background within 3 seconds. Then he went back to the screw. His phone vibrated against his thigh at 9:38. He let it finish the first cycle, set the screwdriver down on the top of the ladder, stepped down, and walked 4 paces along the wall to put a column between himself and the room before he answered. Mrs. Patterson's voice came through, quieter than usual. Eli had needed the nebulizer at 7:45. She had administered the rescue dose. He had finished his cereal afterward and was on the rug watching a program about marine animals. She wanted Daniel to know because she had promised she would always tell him, and because the bowl of cereal had not been finished the way it usually was finished. Daniel listened. He thanked her. He asked her to text him a photograph if Eli's color changed at any point in the next 2 hours, and he told her he would be home at 6 o'clock unless something at the hotel ran long. He returned to the ladder. The conversation had taken 71 seconds. No one in Vivian's group had registered it, and no one would have registered it if they had been standing 5 feet away, because Daniel had learned in a previous life to compress the bandwidth of his voice when the conversation he was having mattered to him. He resumed work on the sconce. He tightened the loosened screw. He tested the mounting plate with 2 fingers. He moved to the second sconce 3 feet down the wall and began checking it for the same fault, because experience had taught him that 1 loose fixture in a row almost always meant a second. It was during this second sconce that he became aware of the man in the catering jacket standing near the Eastern Service entrance. Daniel did not turn his head. He shifted his weight on the ladder by 1/2 inch to bring the eastern wall into the peripheral edge of his vision, and he kept it there for 90 seconds while his hands continued to work the screwdriver. In that 90 seconds, the catering staff member at the eastern entrance did not move his feet. He did not adjust the empty service tray that was balanced against his hip. He looked at the stage twice, each time for somewhere between 1 and 1.5 seconds, and each time the angle of his attention was the same. The first time Daniel might have written it off. By the second time, he was no longer writing it off. He finished the second sconce. He folded the stepladder. He carried the ladder and the toolbox toward the service corridor without looking again at the eastern entrance, and he filed what he had seen into the part of his memory that did not lose things. The lighting control box for the main stage was housed inside a recessed panel built directly into the back wall of the podium platform, and the technician who had been scheduled to verify it that morning had called out sick with a stomach virus before sunrise. The assignment had been pushed to Daniel at 10:40 by the head of facilities, who had walked the request down the corridor in person and apologized for the short notice. The panel had been throwing intermittent voltage warnings on the building management system for 3 days, and the room could not go live tonight with an unverified relay behind the speaker's position. Daniel logged the request, retrieved a multimeter and a flashlight from the engineering closet on the 2nd floor, and returned to the ballroom at 10:52. The room had filled in the interval. The catering staff had begun setting the linen on the perimeter tables. The audio technicians were running cable along the floor of the central aisle and taping it down in strips. The florist's team was carrying the centerpiece arrangements through the rear door in batches of 6, 2 women at a time. The velvet rope that Sandra's people had laid out an hour earlier now formed a clean horseshoe around the front quarter of the ballroom, separating the staging area from the rest of the room with a continuous stanchioned line. The lighting box was on the inside of that horseshoe. Daniel approached the rope from the western side, where a small gap had been left for the audio crew to pass through with their equipment, and stepped through it. He carried the toolbox in his left hand and the flashlight in his right, and he walked the diagonal toward the rear of the podium platform with the unhurried gait of a man who had been given a task and was on his way to perform it. Vivienne was standing 6 meters from the podium with Sandra and 2 of the senior account managers from her merger team. She was in the middle of describing a change she wanted made to the placement of the press riser when the motion at the edge of her vision interrupted her sentence. She stopped speaking. She turned her head. The 3 people standing with her followed her gaze, because that is what people in those rooms learn to do. "You there." Her voice carried the full breadth of the ballroom in the way that voices carry when they have never had to be raised to be heard. "What are you doing on this side of the rope?" Daniel stopped walking. He turned to face her. The toolbox came down to his side. "Checking the lighting control panel behind the platform, ma'am." His voice was level and his diction was clean. "I'll be finished in about 3 minutes." The answer did not satisfy her. He had not apologized for being there, and he had not produced credentials, and he had not lowered his eyes. Vivienne crossed 3 steps of the distance between them, which was enough to make the exchange public rather than incidental. The conversations at the perimeter of the ballroom thinned and went quiet. The audio technicians stopped uncoiling cable. The florists, who were carrying an arrangement past the western columns, slowed their pace to a glide. Security decisions and event logistics are not matters that should concern someone in your position. She was speaking to Daniel, and she was speaking past him. There is a reason this perimeter exists. There is a reason it has been marked. The people who designed it do not require a maintenance worker's interpretation of when it applies to him and when it does not. She paused. She lifted her chin half an inch. A man who makes his living changing light bulbs does not possess the framework necessary to understand what it takes to keep an event of this scale secure. That is what we pay credentialed professionals for. It is not a question of effort. It is a question of capacity. One of the senior account managers, a man named Whitaker, exhaled a sound that was almost a laugh and turned it into a cough at the last possible moment. Sandra wrote something on her tablet that she did not need to write. Marcus Hale was standing 20 feet away, near the main entrance, with his hands clasped behind him, and he did not raise his eyes from the floor. His refusal to look at the room was its own answer. Daniel held Vivienne's gaze for perhaps 2 seconds. His face did not change. The skin around his mouth did not tighten. The hand on the toolbox did not shift its grip. In the back of his mind, 3 images moved in sequence and then were set aside. The sound of Eli's chest at 3 o'clock that morning, working the way a small bellows works when the metal is too thin. The pharmacy receipt taped to the refrigerator door, $482 for the month's supply of the maintenance corticosteroid, due to be refilled on Friday. The envelope from the property management company that had arrived on Saturday with the rent increase notice, an additional $170 a month effective the 1st of next month. The arithmetic of those 3 numbers ran inside him faster than language. He could not lose this job. He could not afford the cost of any reaction that would cost him this job. He inclined his head a 1/4 of an inch. He did not say anything. Then he turned and walked the remaining 4 meters to the rear of the podium, opened the recessed panel, set the toolbox down on the platform behind it, and went to work. The multimeter came out of the kit first. He ran the probes across the primary relay and read the voltage drop. He ran them across the secondary. He found the fault on the 3rd terminal and noted the reading on a folded card from his shirt pocket. He closed the panel. He gathered the toolbox and the flashlight. He stepped back through the rope at the western gap. He walked the length of the side wall toward the service corridor without looking at Vivienne, without looking at Marcus, and without looking at the catering staff member who was still standing by the eastern entrance and who had not moved during any of it. Vivienne watched him until he passed through the service door. Then she turned back to her group and resumed her instructions about the press riser. She said something quiet to Sandra about reinforcing the personnel boundaries with the hotel facilities office before the doors opened that evening. Sandra typed it into the tablet. The ballroom returned, by degrees, to the rhythm of its preparation, and within 90 seconds the conversation along the perimeter had resumed at its earlier volume, as though nothing of significance had occurred. The service corridor along the southern edge of the ballroom had 4 access points back onto the floor, and Daniel used all of them over the next 40 minutes. He returned with a roll of gaffer's tape and worked along the audio cable run. He returned with brass polish and addressed a smudge on the press riser. He returned with a clipboard and a tape measure. He returned with a replacement faceplate for a chipped outlet. None of the errands was invented. He simply ordered them so the eastern half of the room stayed inside his field of vision. The man in the catering jacket had moved. He was no longer at the eastern entrance. He had drifted behind a service cart parked against the southeastern column, then further west to the alcove beside the secondary audio rack, each new position offering a cleaner sightline to the podium. Daniel counted what he was watching. 4 hours in the room. No water served, no tray carried, no surface wiped. 4 times during those 4 hours, the man's right hand had pressed briefly against the fabric of his interior breast pocket. The motion took less than a second each time. A man wearing a wire might check a wire that way. A man carrying something heavier might check it the same way. Daniel walked back into the corridor and made his first call. Reggie Tate was the morning shift security officer assigned to the second-floor service stations. He was 26 and conscientious in the way men became conscientious early in careers they meant to take seriously. Daniel laid out what he had been watching in sequential language: the position changes, the duration, the pocket check. Reggie keyed his radio and ran the description against the catering manifest. The voice on the other end came back inside 30 seconds. The individual matching the description was a confirmed staff member from a subcontractor the hotel had used before, and his badge had been scanned at 0730. He was on the approved list. Reggie said he would keep an eye on the eastern side during his next circuit. Daniel thanked him and returned to the ballroom. He chose his next errand to take him along the southern wall. From that vector, he watched the man drift again, this time into the narrow space between the press riser and the stack of folded chairs, an angle that cleared the right side of the podium. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped into the alcove and read the message. Mrs. Patterson had written 4 lines. Eli had taken a harder hit 10 minutes earlier. She had used the nebulizer. The breathing had settled, but this was the second episode of the day, and the pediatric clinic should be moved up. Eli was asking when his father would be home. Daniel typed back that he would call the clinic on his break, that he would be home at 6, that he loved both of them. He drew one breath through his nose and let it out slowly through his mouth. He approached Andrea Kim near the rear entrance. She was Marcus Hale's deputy and had a tablet in her hand. He gave her the account he had given Reggie, and he gave her more of it. The timing intervals. The position changes in sequence. The pocket check gesture described in the specific terms of a hand confirming the location of an object it intended to reach for quickly. He did not name the object. Andrea listened the way competent professionals listen to information that conflicts with what their systems have already produced. The paperwork had cleared, she said. The badge had scanned cleanly. She could not pull an approved staff member on the basis of a behavioral read from a maintenance worker. She would mention it to Marcus on the next radio check. Daniel waited in the south corridor for 11 minutes. When Marcus Hale completed his 4th patrol circuit and stepped into the corridor, Daniel stepped into his path. "Mr. Hale, 60 seconds. Marcus checked his watch. "Make it count." Daniel laid out the facts in the order he had organized them. 4 hours of presence with no service activity, the repositioning, the 4 pocket checks, the current angle to the podium. He did not characterize any of it. He let the pattern carry itself. Marcus listened. The expression behind his eyes shifted a fraction, but his answer was the answer his training required him to give. The credentials had been verified at 0730. The contractor had been vetted for 3 previous events. He would direct Andrea to perform a visual sweep during her next interior circuit. That was what he could authorize. Daniel inclined his head once. That's all I needed to know. He turned, picked up his toolbox from inside the service door, and carried it to the next item on his task list. He did not look at the man in the catering jacket again. Looking would change nothing, and he had now confirmed, beyond any further argument with himself, that when the moment arrived, he would arrive at it alone. At 6 o'clock, his 30-minute break came up on the schedule, and Daniel took it the way he took everything, on time and without comment. He left the ballroom through the south corridor, climbed 2 flights of the rear service stairwell to the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, where the cellular signal was strongest and the foot traffic was non-existent, and called the apartment in Dorchester. Mrs. Patterson answered on the 2nd ring. Her report was steadier than it had been at 3. Eli had taken the afternoon dose without resistance. He had eaten half a sandwich. He was lying on the couch under the gray blanket with the cartoon about the deep-sea creatures playing again, the one he asked for whenever his chest was tired and his color was good. Daniel asked the questions a parent of an asthmatic child learns to ask without thinking, about the rate of the breathing and the sound of it, and whether the lips had stayed pink, and the answers were the answers he needed. He told her he would be home by 6:30, 7 at the latest, depending on how long the floor took to break down after the event went live. Then she handed the phone to the boy. "Dad?" The voice came through small and frayed at the edges, the way it always sounded after a hard day with the medication. "Are you going to be home before I fall asleep?" Daniel set his jaw and kept his voice exactly where it needed to be, even and warm and certain of itself, which was the hardest thing he did all day. "I'm going to try, buddy. I'm going to try my hardest. You keep drinking your water for me, all right? Big sips. I'll see you tonight." The boy said, "Okay." He said he loved him. The line went quiet. Daniel lowered the phone and stood alone on the landing with the stairwell light buzzing faintly above him. He looked down at his own hands. These were the hands that had pulled 4 men out of a collapsing structure outside Mosul, while the 2nd floor came down through the 1st that had carried a wounded sergeant the length of a rooftop under fire without dropping him, that had done things in 8 years of service that he had stopped describing to anyone including himself. These were the same hands that shook now, faintly, when he opened the banking app each morning and watched the balance fall toward a number he could not let it reach. The memory came the way those memories came, sideways and without permission. 3 years ago, a Thursday in October, the phone ringing in the middle of a deployment briefing and the duty officer's face when he handed it over. A state trooper's voice telling him there had been a collision on Route 3, that his wife had been driving back from the preschool pickup, that he needed to come home. Sarah had lived for 11 days on a ventilator before her body let go, and the bills from those 11 days had outlived her by years. He remembered kneeling on the kitchen floor of an apartment they had not yet finished unpacking, holding a 3-year-old who did not have the words yet to understand why his mother was not coming through the door, and telling him anyway, because someone had to. He remembered filing the discharge paperwork the following spring. He remembered the first morning he had put on the gray maintenance uniform and looked at himself in the mirror and felt a part of who he had been lower quietly into the ground and the dirt close over it. He had buried that man on purpose. He had chosen the burial. It was the right trade, and he had made it with his eyes open. Now he stood on the landing and ran the arithmetic that was the only kind of arithmetic that had ever mattered to him. If he acted and he was wrong, he lost the job, the health coverage that kept Eli's specialist appointments inside reach, and the apartment. If he acted and he was right but put his hands on a billionaire's head of security to do it, he lost all of the same things because no event company on earth would hear the second half of that story. And if he did not act, and he was the only person in the building who had seen it coming, then somewhere in the next 2 hours a man would draw a weapon in a crowded room and people would die who did not have to. He made himself look at the worst version of it directly, because looking away from it was a luxury he could not afford. If something happened to him tonight, Eli would not be alone. Mrs. Patterson had the emergency contact card taped inside the kitchen cabinet. She had promised, more than once, that if Daniel ever failed to come home, she would call Sarah's younger sister in Oregon, who had a spare room and a steady job, and had asked, gently, more than once, whether she could do more. The boy would have somewhere to go. It would not be this home, and it would not be him, but it would be somewhere, and the boy would be loved. Daniel drew one long breath and held it until his pulse came down to where he wanted it. He thought of a thing his first team leader had said to a room full of young men who did not yet understand it. The cost of inaction is always higher than the cost of acting wrong, because acting wrong you can answer for, and inaction answers for you. He put the phone in his pocket. He went back down the stairs. The main event was 2 hours out. The man in the catering jacket was still on the floor. The doors opened at 7, and the guests came in the way that people of a certain altitude come into a room, neither early enough to seem eager nor late enough to seem careless, clustering in the narrow band between the two. The ballroom filled by degrees with the low, controlled murmur of people whose conversations were transactions. Glasses touched glasses with a soft, repeated chime along the bar. The air carried the layered smell of expensive perfume cut through with the cold sweetness of the lily arrangements that had been carried in that morning, 6 at a time, by 2 women at a time. 250 names were on the list, and most of them arrived. A United States Senator from Massachusetts worked the room along the eastern wall, trailing 2 aides who whispered the identities of approaching guests into the gap behind his shoulder. 3 venture capitalists down from New York stood near the bar with the particular ease of men who had already decided the evening was beneath their full attention. The chief executive of Crestview Medical Solutions, whose company would cease to exist as an independent entity before midnight, shook hands near the stage with a fixed and gracious smile. 5 medical reporters stood slightly apart from the clusters, holding drinks they were not drinking, watching the room with the patience of people paid to notice what others missed. Vivienne moved through all of it like a woman who had been engineered for exactly this kind of room. She did not smile often, but she smiled at the right moments and at the right people, and she withheld it the rest of the time in a way that made each instance feel earned. She introduced herself to people who already knew precisely who she was. She said the reassuring thing to the investor who needed reassuring, and the sharp thing to the rival who needed reminding. She managed the temperature of the room with a calibration that came only from doing this for a very long time, and Sandra stayed 2 steps behind her left shoulder, logging the names she would need to follow up with in the morning. Daniel worked the edges. He pushed a supply cart along the southern wall and checked the return vents in the baseboard, and he topped off the linen stock at the rear service station, and the entire time his attention stayed fixed on a single point in the room. The man in the catering jacket had taken a new position. He stood now in the front left quadrant of the ballroom, half screened behind one of the decorative columns, roughly 9 meters from the podium platform. The angle from where he stood to the speaker's microphone was clean and unobstructed. Daniel registered the change in the man's posture before he registered anything else. The left hand, which had moved with the rest of him all afternoon, now hung still and close against the seam of the trousers, the fingers loose but not idle, the way a hand goes still when it is waiting to do one specific thing. A folded white towel had appeared over the man's right forearm, the universal credential of a server who belongs wherever he happens to be standing. At 8, the house lights dimmed by a third. A ripple of applause moved across the room, polite and unhurried, and Vivienne crossed the stage to the podium with the ease of a woman who had crossed 100 stages, exactly like it. She adjusted the microphone with a single precise motion and looked out across the room. She thanked her guests for coming. She named the partnership that the evening would formalize and described, in 2 clean sentences, what it would mean for the future of pediatric care across the region. She turned to the second purpose of the night, the foundation that funded treatment for children with rare and chronic conditions, and her voice took on the warmth she reserved for the part of the night that mattered to her in a way the merger never could. Daniel was already moving. He kept to the outer edge of the room, behind the last row of banquet tables, his pace the unremarkable pace of a man with somewhere to be. He had closed 2/3 of the distance, 9 meters of clear floor between himself and the column, when Marcus Hale stepped directly into his path. Marcus had been watching him for 10 minutes. What he had seen, a maintenance worker moving with deliberate purpose toward the front of a secured room while the principal stood exposed at a microphone, had tripped the exact response his training had wired into him over 2 careers. He raised one hand, not aggressively, but with the flat finality of a man who did not expect to be questioned. Staff are not permitted in the forward floor section during the address. Daniel spoke low, without urgency, every word landing flat and clear. There's a man at the front left corner who's about to move on the stage. Black server's jacket, towel over his left forearm, behind the column. You need to look at him right now. Marcus did not look. His eyes stayed on Daniel. Return to the service area. That's the last time I say it. Daniel looked past the larger man's shoulder. The figure at the column had shifted his weight forward onto the balls of his feet. The left hand had begun to rise from his side. On the stage, Vivian was 40 seconds into her opening remarks. Daniel made the decision in the only span the situation allowed him, which was the fraction of a second between the rise of the left hand and the moment it reached its work. He stepped to Marcus's left. He did not strike him. He brought his right forearm against the back of Marcus's extended hand and redirected it across the larger man's own center line, using the momentum of the reach instead of fighting it, turning the limb past Daniel's body rather than against it. He pivoted in behind Marcus's shoulder as the arm carried through, and he applied a measured downward pressure to the joint at the back of the right shoulder, a point that produced no lasting damage and no real choice. Marcus dropped to one knee with a short, involuntary grunt forced out through his teeth. There was nothing violent in any of it. It was precise the way a key is precise in a lock. Daniel held him for exactly the length of time required to confirm that the larger man would not come back up inside the next 3 seconds, and then he released him and was already moving. At the column, the man in the catering jacket had reached into the interior fold of his coat. The object came partway out as Daniel crossed the remaining floor, a flat, dark shape clearing the lip of the jacket, the muzzle beginning to swing up toward the line that ran to the stage. Daniel covered the last 4 meters at a dead sprint that he kept low and silent, and he arrived before the arm finished its arc. His left hand came down hard across the man's wrist and drove the weapon's angle down and away, off the line to the podium and into the floor. His right hand closed over the elbow. He folded both points of leverage together, the wrist below and the elbow above, and put the full weight of his body behind the man's center of mass, driving him backward into the wall hard enough to empty the air out of his lungs in a single flat sound and pin every joint past the range it needed to function. The pistol, a compact black Glock 19, came loose and clattered against the marble. Daniel put his foot on it. The entire sequence, from the redirection of Marcus's hand to the weapon striking the floor, had taken under 4 seconds. For 1 full beat, the ballroom did not react at all. The guests nearest the front left corner were the first to understand what their eyes had given them, and their sharp collective intake of breath traveled backward through the room in a spreading wave, table by table, until 250 people had all turned toward the same 9 square meters of floor. Vivian had stopped speaking mid-sentence. She stood at the podium with one hand still resting on its edge and looked down at the scene below the stage, and her face had not yet decided what it was. The composure she wore the way other people wore clothing had simply suspended itself, leaving behind something unguarded that the room had never been permitted to see. Marcus had gotten back to his feet. He stood 3 meters away with one hand pressed to his right shoulder, looking at the man flattened against the wall, at the gun under Daniel's boot, at Daniel himself. For the first time that evening, his face had no protocol available to it. The whole structure of training and rank and certainty that had carried him through the afternoon had nothing left to say. His team converged within seconds. 2 officers came off the main entrance at a run, and a third came in from the rear, all of them moving fast and clean toward the front left corner now that the threat had been named for them by the floor itself. They took the man out of Daniel's grip with practiced hands, and they had him secured and walked out through the service door in under 2 minutes. The room parting around them in stunned silence. Daniel stepped back from the wall. He bent and picked up the towel that had fallen from the man's forearm during the struggle, folded it once along its original crease out of a habit older than the uniform he was wearing, and set it down on the nearest table. There was a thin cut across the heel of his right palm where the edge of a wall bracket had opened the skin during the takedown. He pressed the folded towel against it, judged it minor inside a second, and let it go. The ballroom held in a heavy, suspended quiet, the particular stillness that settles over a crowd that has just understood how close it stood to something it cannot name. A cluster of guests near the back had drifted toward the emergency exits without deciding to, the way a body flinches before the mind catches up. Others had not moved at all, frozen in place as though motion itself might restart the thing they had just survived. A few had their phones half raised and then lowered again, uncertain whether what they had witnessed was real enough to record. Vivian had not stepped down from the podium. She stood behind the microphone with both hands now at her sides and looked directly at Daniel Reeves, and it was not the fixed, appraising stare she had aimed at him that afternoon when she had told a room full of her own people what a man in his position could not understand. This was a different kind of looking. It was the look that arrives when every assumption a person has been running on, smoothly and without examination, for a very long time, abruptly requires re-examination, and the mind has not yet located the place to begin. Marcus crossed the floor toward Daniel slowly, one hand still resting against his right shoulder. When he reached him, he stopped at a distance of 1 meter and looked at him with a face that was no longer professional and no longer managed, stripped down to something more basic than either. "Where did you train?" Daniel met his eyes without strain. "A long time ago." Marcus held the look for a moment. Then he lowered his gaze to the marble between them and nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he is working through something he does not yet have the words to carry. The sirens began arriving outside the hotel, the first thin wail folding into a second and a third along Beacon Street. Hotel security spread through the room in belated numbers, radios crackling, hands directing guests toward the side walls. The official response, with all its volume and procedure and authority, had finally shown up 4 seconds after the only thing that had mattered was already finished. The police came through the doors within 6 minutes of the first call. Daniel gave his statement to a detective named Carla Reyes, a deliberate woman in her early 50s who wrote everything down by hand in a spiral notebook and asked her questions in an order that told him she had already grasped the shape of what had happened and was simply confirming the joints of it. He told her what he had observed, when he had observed it, and in what sequence. He did not editorialize. He did not raise the afternoon. When she asked how he had been able to take down both Marcus Hale and the suspect without causing injury to either of them, Daniel said only that he had some prior experience in personal protection work. Reyes looked up from her notebook. She held his gaze for a beat longer than the question required. Daniel held hers. She wrote something down that took longer than the words he had given her, thanked him for his time, and told him they would be in touch. He sat down on a folding chair near the mouth of the service corridor and pressed the towel against his palm again. The cut had stopped on its own. Around him the room reorganized itself into the slow machinery of an investigated scene, and he let it move past him without participating in it. Sandra appeared beside him after a while, holding a bottle of water and wearing the careful expression of someone dispatched on an errand by a person much further up the chain than herself. "Ms. Ashcroft would like to speak with you, whenever you're ready." Daniel looked at the bottle. He took it, and he stood. "I'm ready now." Vivienne was waiting in the small private room that adjoined the ballroom, the holding space the hotel reserved for principals during events, furnished with 2 low sofas and a single lamp, and separated from the procedural noise outside by a heavy door that reduced it all to a distant murmur. She was standing when he came in, and Daniel registered that as a deliberate choice rather than an accident of timing. She had taken off the structured charcoal jacket she had worn all day, and stood now in just the white blouse beneath it, and without the full armor of the event around her, she looked like a person rather than a position. Marcus was in the room as well, near the far wall, his hands no longer clasped behind his back. Vivienne did not open with pleasantries. That was consistent with everything Daniel had observed about her across the day, and he had not expected otherwise. "I've been told you reported the suspect to hotel security at approximately 4 o'clock this afternoon, and to Marcus directly at approximately 6:30. "That's correct," Daniel said. She absorbed it without moving. The paperwork was valid. The background check had cleared. From a protocol standpoint, they made the decision the system told them to make. Someone still had to act. It was a more generous framing than the situation required, and she appeared to recognize that. Something shifted across her face, not quite discomfort, but the thing that lives directly beside it, the particular unsettlement of a person being treated more fairly than they had treated someone else. Vivienne let her hands fall to her sides. "I said some things to you this afternoon." She did not look away while she said it, which Daniel noted. "I made an assessment based on your position here, and I was wrong about it. Significantly wrong." Daniel did not fill the silence. He did not offer her reassurance, and he did not offer her anger, because he felt neither, and supplying either one would have made the moment easier for her than it had any right to be. "That isn't how I should operate. It isn't how I would want anyone in my organization to operate, and I did it in a room full of my own people." She stopped, and this time the stop was not about searching for the right words. It was about something harder to hold than language. "I owe you an apology. A real one, not a managed one. I'm sorry." "I appreciate that," Daniel said. And he did. Marcus pushed off the far wall and walked to the center of the room. He stopped a few feet from Daniel and extended his hand. When Daniel took it, Marcus held the grip a moment longer than the gesture asked for. "I should have listened to you, not just the last time, the first time you came to me." His voice carried no qualification, which was the only way Daniel would have wanted to hear it. "I had the information, and I made the wrong call. Every person in that room tonight was a consequence of that decision." He let go. Vivienne asked it quietly. "Where did you serve?" Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he gave it to them plainly, because they had earned the plain version. "Marine Raiders. I separated 3 years ago. I held a captain's commission." She took it in. "Why maintenance?" "My wife died 3 years ago. A car accident." Or, he said it the way a man says a thing he has said to himself 10,000 times until the words have worn smooth. "I have a 7-year-old son with chronic asthma. The maintenance work gives me the hours to take him to school and pick him up. It puts me close to the children's hospital where he's treated, and it doesn't carry the weight of decisions that end lives. That was the trade I made." The room held still around the words. Vivienne looked at him, and it was not pity in her eyes, which he would have refused, but the look of a person recalibrating an entire framework of understanding in real time, fitting a new shape into a space she had not known, was empty. The investigation that unfolded over the following 3 days filled in the picture Daniel had been reading in fragments since morning. The man in the catering jacket was identified as Vincent Doyle, 41, a former research scientist at Ashcroft Biomedical, who had been terminated 18 months earlier after raising an internal complaint about an experimental drug trial that had never been resolved to his satisfaction. The grievance had curdled in the time since. The credentials that had carried him through the staff entrance at 0730 had been obtained through a forged vendor relationship that passed the standard verification process without tripping a single flag, a gap that Marcus's team afterward documented with the unsparing thoroughness of professionals who understood it had to close before it cost someone something that could not be recovered. Doyle was charged, remanded, and the legal process began moving in the direction such processes move when the evidence is clean and the witnesses are credible. The event itself was rescheduled for 3 weeks later, and the second time it ran without incident. 3 days after the incident, Vivian came back to the Ashford Royale. She had a brief meeting with the hotel's general manager about the logistics of the rescheduled event, and on her way out, she found Daniel in the second-floor corridor, standing on the same aluminum stepladder, fitting a new bulb into one of the wall sconces that had failed during the chaos of the police response. She stopped a few feet from the base of the ladder. "I offered you a position through Sandra. I'm told you declined." "I did," Daniel said. He seated the bulb and tested the fixture. It came on warm and even. "May I ask why?" He came down the 2 rungs and folded the ladder against his side. "Eli, my son, knows I pick him up at 3 o'clock every day. He knows I'm in the room when his chest gives out at night." He said it without heat, laying the reason down the way he laid everything down, flat and complete. "I lost something that couldn't be replaced 3 years ago. I'm not going to lose any more of it. A better title, even one that pays more, doesn't buy that back." Vivienne looked at him, her expression still doing the quiet work it had been doing since the night of the gala. "There's something else I'd like to offer, not a job." She paused, choosing the words so they would carry the right weight and no more. "Eli can be treated at the Ashcroft Children's Medical Center at no cost for the rest of his life. That's my own foundation, not the company. You don't owe me anything for it. It's simply something I want to do." Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. He read her the way he read everyone, and he saw that she meant it, not as charity, which he would have refused, but as the closest thing a person in her position had to an acknowledgement. "I'll accept that," he said, "for Eli. Thank you." Vivian nodded once. She extended her hand, and they shook, a clean, direct handshake between 2 people who understood each other more accurately than they had 24 hours earlier, which was more than most people ever managed. She walked down the corridor toward the elevators. Daniel watched her go for a moment, then picked up the ladder, gathered his kit, and moved on to the next sconce that needed his attention. He finished the corridor at 7:43 in the evening. He drove home to Dorchester through the ordinary traffic in the ordinary way. Eli was waiting at the apartment door with Mrs. Patterson, and the boy broke loose and ran the length of the hallway, and Daniel caught him up into his arms. He was heavier than he had been a year ago. He was growing the way children grow when someone is paying attention. That night, Daniel sat on the edge of the boy's bed and read to him until he slept, and then he stayed a moment longer than he needed to and looked at his son's face, his mother's eyes, his mother's nose, the rare and complete peace of a sleep that the asthma, for once, was not interrupting. A person's worth was never written on the badge clipped to their chest or in the number at the bottom of their account. It lived in the choices they made when no one was watching, in the people they were willing to stand between and harm when no one had asked them to, and in the dignity they kept hold of when they were treated as though they had none. Some of the bravest people alive wear no uniform. Anyone salutes. They wear maintenance grays. They push the hospital cart down the corridor at midnight. They drive the early bus through the dark before the city wakes. They are all around us, every day, and most of the time we do not see them until the moment we cannot afford to have missed them. If this story moved you, take a second to subscribe, to like, and to share it with someone who needs it. And leave a comment below. Have you ever underestimated someone because of the work they did, and later realized how wrong you were? Your story might be exactly what another person needs to read today. And before you go, sit with this one question. When was the last time you truly looked at someone doing work the world calls small? They may be carrying a story far deeper than anything you imagined. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. May you and the people you love stay healthy, stay safe, and always keep the kind of eyes that can see the real person standing behind the role they happen to be wearing.